Consider This, a news and information program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. From the Fireside Lounge in the Milo Bales Student Center, here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hi, and welcome back to the University of Nebraska at Omaha and to Consider This. About 2 years ago, I had the pleasure of interviewing the then brand new public safety. I actually was the police auditor because since then the City Council has expanded the role of City of Omaha police auditor to public safety to include the fire department. Tristan Bond comes here again today, about 2 years later. She's got some time under her belt. She's got some reports, quarterly reports under her belt, and has this past week made some observations based on the gathering of data that was never quite done before. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome
Thanks
back.
for having. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
We have kind of a thing on the show where we measure, you know, when you've moved up to second appearance. That may not be a good thing for you, but we think it's a good thing for us to touch base every
Right.
so often.
Oh, good.
You might say, I never want to do it again. This office, I remember the angst over which it was created long before you came back to Omaha. You
Right.
were a student at Creighton Law School, so
Right.
Omaha was not new to you, but
Right.
There was angst. There was probably a little angst as you took the position and
Right.
started to try to put it, not just took the position and started doing anything, but to put an office together, to put a procedure together, because there aren't that many police auditors in this country.
That's correct.
Do you feel that you've got that sort of thing under your belt? Because you don't want to reinvent the wheel, but on the other hand, you are inventing the wheel.
Today, compared to what I knew 2 years ago, the learning curve has been tremendous. There's no question, and I think that we have succeeded in putting good processes in place. The office, although it's moved once, is now in kind of a stable and good location. We have good access, so I think we've made a lot of headway. And also, just having the ability to connect with other auditors across the country and oversight, and then have some of the resources that are available here in Omaha have been, a great help to the office.
Let's just do a little fact file here real quick.
Right.
Your location now is?
1905 Harney Street. We're in the Exchange Building at Suite 530. We moved there about November of just this past year.
One of the things that I think that was a big job, in addition to trying to organize the procedural, just get on your feet and
Right.
was to educate the public as to who you were,
Right.
To the fact that you don't do your own investigations,
Right.
That you work along or observe and kind of evaluate the internal affairs. And one of the things that was done also since you came is to expand the number of places and the ways that which people could file their complaint.
Right.
Before they'd have to, they could pick it up a number of places, but they had to take it down, give it to the police department for the first contact. People can make their first contact with your office if for some reason they don't feel comfortable.
Right. What's happened, what's kind of evolved is that people oftentimes do call our office to get the initial information. How do I find a complaint? Where is it? What's going to happen? And we can take some of the initial information. Much of the procedure really hasn't changed with the internal affairs.
Right.
It just gives kind of a wider entry, if you will, to how the whole complaint process works, not just for the police department, but also for the fire department.
And one of the things that I remember in the discussion of creating the position, that nationally, I don't know about locally because I don't know if we had any stats, but probably in bigger cities where there are more complicated issues between the public and the police, people didn't like to make that first encounter having to go into a police station, and a lot of people still thought they had to do it that way.
Right.
So you're coming in and sort of helping to educate the public, help sort of re-educate the public.
Right.
In a sense as to how our system's fairly open.
Right, and some of the recommendations we have made for both police and fire is to broaden that process even more. There are lots of ways people make contact with the police and fire department that don't necessarily result in an internal affairs investigation. And I think some people thought that was the only way I could have my complaint heard. So part of what we do in the reports is explain that process. When people call, we explain that process. And then we also make recommendations to both departments how to include, and gather more information about complaints. An example is the both the police and fire department have changed their complaint form to just give better instruction on the complaint form. And it sounds like a fairly minor change, and in some ways it was, but it's had a great effect in just making the whole process easier for people to use.
You know, I've learned a lot in the past 2 years about this process. One thing I don't know, it just dawned on me today, is that if I just want to call and not make a complaint,
right.
in other words, don't want something investigated.
Right.
In other words, I just want to comment or compliment.
Right, right.
But you know, there's those kind of complaints you want to make that are just
Yes.
for the record.
Right.
Just make note of me, pay attention to
Right.
me, just listen to me. Do they have to go through that whole process?
No,
Can they write a letter? Can
Yes. And oftentimes that's what people want to do. They just want to be heard. They want to be on record. They can call our office. They can call the Internal Affairs Department. They can call the chief and or write a letter. So there's a number of ways that you can still capture that information, and it doesn't require you going through a full-blown investigation. You also, if you want to be more specific about an officer or a particular incident, you can also talk to an immediate supervisor, and oftentimes the department will do what they call a line investigation, a supervisory investigation of whatever the complaint was.
The thing is that investigation does not necessarily go into the database that you're building.
Well, if you notice in the reports, we collect two types of contacts. Just all contacts with our office, which we do include everything. People call, questions, referrals. And then the other numbers that we break out specifically are actually the department's numbers, and the department tracks formal investigations. So that's what information is in there also.
When they talked about creating this position, we had a citizens review board
right.
Prior to that, where it was a group of citizens who would, I was never quite clear, they sort of would take an additional complaint if people weren't happy with the internal affairs investigation, or check up on internal affairs, or whatever. Was it similar?
Yeah, I think they reviewed certain cases and made recommendations, but the investigation, as I understood it, was already completed. And that may not be totally accurate either, because it was about the time that I was here that was dissolved. It's not uncommon that an auditor may exist in conjunction with a civilian review, or sometimes the auditor and civilian review are sort of subsumed into the same office. They across the country serve slightly different purposes. Auditors usually have a different access than citizen reviews do, which is, for instance, what our office has. We can actually be in on interviews to monitor them to ensure that they're being conducted fairly. So that entails actually sitting in on investigations and being able to make inquiry during the course of interviews, for instance, which a Citizens Review Board typically doesn't have. Sometimes they do if they have a subpoena power. There are several different variations on what kind of oversight a city can select.
Well, speaking of being in on interviews, a couple of things have happened or not happened since you've been here. One is that I believe when you arrived that there was a 60-day amount of time that this internal affairs investigation had to be not only complete, but if there was some sort of penalty or judgments that were not the appropriate word,
discipline,
you're not a discipline
right.
for an officer,
right.
that it had to, by union contract, be handed to them on that 60th day or before, or you could take no action.
Right.
That time frame has been, by union negotiation with the city, has been brought down to 45 days.
Right.
And then I read in your report that it is sometimes difficult for you to follow the investigation, because when you can't be at an interview,
right.
Which sometimes is just going to be a logistical thing, or they get a chance to interview, or scheduling conflicts of the person that is being interviewed and the police,
right.
They can't get the transcriptions to you
right.
of the interviews because they're short of work staff. So this shorter 15 days, which nothing can be done about it, it's a negotiated
right, under
issue
the current
under the current contract.
Right.
But have you noticed a difference in the 60 days and the 45 days in your ability to, and internal affairs ability to?
Right. Actually, the 60-day, the change in the contract literally was adopted the week I started.
Okay, so you didn't.
the previous, I'm not sure. I can only say, just based on what happens in the 45 days, that the additional 15 days would definitely help to both give investigators in the Internal Affairs Department enough time to do their investigation, but also give the auditor enough time to monitor it. And that has been a recommendation that next time that comes up, that it's something that the city should look to extending so that it can accommodate the auditing process. But not just because the auditing process, 45 days is typically a very short
Well, when you take
time
deduct
frame.
weekends and
Well, it's 45 working days, so you actually
it's
get a
working
little
days. You
bit
get a little
more. But more, oftentimes the problem is, gosh, by the time you get enough people scheduled in for interviews and, just calling people and getting rescheduled, it goes by
every
quickly.
investigation is different.
Yes.
Some of them don't even take the 45
That's right.
days.
No, some don't. But if you have several, personnel, like for instance in fire interviews or fire investigations, which is even shorter, typically you have a lot of personnel at any event, and so you need to interview all of those people.
Yeah, because there's several people
That's
at a
right.
scene, and like a
That's
police
right.
officer, it could be a one-on-one encounter.
Right, and so maybe that investigation you don't need the full time, but a lot of investigations require a lot of interviews.
In the 7 reports that you've issued so far,
Right.
and just issues quarterly reports on the investigations that are done, kind of different categories they fall into, how they come out, you've noticed some trends, and you
Yes.
made note of those in your first quarter report for this year. And I'm not out on the streets as much as I used to be, so I can't really get a feel for how they're being accepted. But it's some of the things that you noted, and I was actually surprised at this one, that many officers, or at least some officers, rely on what they call the visual estimate of speed.
Right.
And I assumed what it says in the paper and says in your report, that the state law reflects kind of a higher standard or more accurate standard.
Corroboration.
Corroboration.
Right.
Mechanical, speed gun.
Right. Radar.
I suppose if you're following them and they're driving in excess and you're keeping up with them.
You could do a pace, you could do a clock, radar clock, right. There's various ways.
You can tell I was going 70 and I still couldn't keep up with this guy who was.
Right. But the visual estimate speed, an officer is trained to make a speed estimate exactly as it sounds, but it's a plus or minus as opposed to the corroboration. And so what was identified is what I refer to as kind of this practice drifts, where maybe prior to the statute actually being adopted, there may have been more reliance on a visual estimate of speed, and maybe that's a practice that has lingered beyond when the law has changed. And so those are the kinds of things that, by looking at complaints and citizens' complaints and seeing what may be factors causing some of those complaints, and some people literally complained, I got pulled over for speeding and I wasn't speeding, or there was no radar, or something like that would give you a heads up to look to see if there was some cause. And that was one of the things that turned up.
2 of the ones that kind of to me fall in not the same category but the same discussion.
Right.
Was that police make disorderly conduct arrests on the basis of swearing or arguing with an officer, and officers sometimes are rude or use profanity. Now, they're not the exact same things, but we live in a society that, 50 years ago, it would have been very clear if someone was being disorderly.
Right.
I mean, there was the level of civility or
right,
the understanding of civility,
right.
That certain words automatically became fighting words.
Right.
Now our society is a little, ask any teacher in a public school or a private school for that matter,
right.
that you don't know, you're debating all the time whether to take certain words, as is in our school, do we send them to the office for it?
Right.
Do we ignore it? Do we say that this is a cultural thing?
Right. Well, I'll just step back for a second. But one of the common themes and the patterns that were identified, and it's also probably a fairly good explanation why you get complaints around this area, is because the department guidelines are no longer necessarily clear in these situations. It could be that rudeness at one time had a clear, you could say to an officer what's rude, and he or she would know what rude is. And that clarity doesn't exist in practice. And there is an internal standard operating procedure that requires that officers not be rude. So you need to know what that means. And then the flip side of that, on the disorderly conduct, and it's word crimes that are basically words alone, are always sort of difficult to specify with a great deal of clarity, but there's also a standard there that the law requires, and you have to make sure that the words reach that criminal standard. So on both sides, what it really requires is some you know, making sure that your guidelines are clear, that you're following up on those guidelines, that you're tracking those cases, and where need be, training if that's required.
Many of the recommendations you've made in the past almost 2 years to the police department, based on the kinds of complaints you're getting, you've made, you know, had to do with training,
right,
or more training, or putting a training video together. In other words, training was at the heart, or at least review,
right,
or clarification. You could have a standard operating procedure, but then you don't kind of have guidelines that make kind of clear what that all entails.
Right. Your standard operating procedure could be well drafted, but it's not being enforced and practiced. Or you could have a standard operating procedure that needs more guidance and needs more guidelines so that officers know exactly what the expectation is. And I think probably training is one of those items that oftentimes does get cut when there's budget issues. But I think it's so critical to make sure training or performance review or that level of supervision is constant. And one of the things that was, I have noted in past reports that is of some concern, I think, is the fact that the Omaha Police Department doesn't have an annual, regular review that all officers attend, like for instance the State Patrol does. And again, it's a time and it's a cost factor, and those are always considerations. But when you're working in a field like this, it's so important to keep abreast of all of these issues. I think that's significant.
Well, the issue of training or retraining,
right,
or touching bases
right,
again,
continuing training,
comes very clear when you look at the fact that if you divide years of experience,
right,
you know, pick categories 1 to 3 years, and then you have several, I don't know
right,
exactly what they are, 5 to 7, whatever, but 1 to 3 is the first one.
Right.
But the 1 to 3, the most inexperienced officer, could be a very good officer, but the lack of experience, and
right,
you know, you could probably expand that as to reinforcement and
right,
training and
right,
practice.
Right, exactly.
So
exactly.
that most of the complaints, a good chunk, not most by number,
right,
but it has the highest,
yes,
number per age category,
right,
or years on the
service,
force,
right? And we recently started tracking that, and it's significant. You're right, because you do need that practice and reinforcement, but it's also doubly significant for OPD because they're facing a huge turnover through retirement alone.
There's some changes in the union contract,
right,
that will allow, I won't say a mass exodus soon.
I think it's about 80 people probably within the next 12 months.
And that's not only just the experience they have, but the
right,
experience they sort of pass on.
Exactly.
In mentoring or office, you know, or supervisory roles.
Right.
And so this whole training, retraining, respecifying is going to be, not because you said so,
right,
but it's happening in the fire department too,
right,
with their
right,
change in retirement policy, that a wealth of information
right,
and that body of knowledge,
yes,
that's stored
exactly,
up here isn't passed on or have the chance to
and that's where a lot
around.
of people do learn on the job, and it may not always show up, you're right, like in an SOP or, you know, on paper somewhere, but it is that, you know, mentoring and on the job supervising and performance that.
So the fact that our 1 to 3 year of service anyway, who in a few years maybe
right,
3 to 5 or 3 to 6 years, that's still
right,
and that's sometimes an area where officers are in the most danger, not because they're not good, but because they're not experienced.
Right.
They haven't had that sort of, I've done that 20 times,
yeah,
and I've done this.
Right, it's going to be a very young department very soon.
Now, this isn't true just because you say so. This
right,
is happening kind of all over the country,
right,
as the way our budget situations and things, and we're just going to see this more and more. They're seeing it in the ranks of the teachers. They're seeing, and this is so this is something that we're going to be seeing continually. The stress on training, probably in your reports.
Yes, and you know,
But if they don't have the money,
yeah, well, it's,
and they're strained on the numbers of officers on the streets, how do you have a discussion on this with the mayor, with the chief? The chiefs, because and all these kinds of things.
Well, it does call for a lot of creativity and a lot of innovation, but I think, like for instance, historically a lot of the training has occurred, at a location. Trainers are brought in, although there is a training unit in the police department. But I think that you can construct less expensive training opportunities. You buy more review, buy more kind of performance reviews, buy
or
better
the assembly
video.
halls when they come
Exactly.
on
You've got the
duty.
roll call. You've got the, and it's not the best, environment. Of course, you'd like to be able to have the money to do it as completely as possible, but there are ways that you can still address those issues.
I noticed too that the number of complaints from citizens tends to come from north of that little line we have in our city called Dodge Street. That northeast and northwest
Right.
have a larger body of complaints. And I also noticed that your reports aren't broken down, and I don't know if this is intentionally, if it even should be this way, by race. Because race and concerns about race in the parts of the African American community in here was some of the impetus to have an independent
Right.
police auditor.
We will probably start reporting on more pure demographics about complainants, and to some extent probably about officers too. Part of that is limited by what information the department collects, because we get a lot of that information from them, and then also what information we can accurately and capably report and collect. But that's an area, as we add each and every category, that will be another area we start reporting on, the demographics of people who complain and also of the people they complain about.
Now you're a lawyer, you taught
Yes.
the law. Obviously, I don't know if being a lawyer was a requirement for your position.
You could have law enforcement experience or a law degree.
But obviously, the issue of legality
Right.
is one of the things that the citizens who wanted an auditor were concerned about. So, do you look at it from not as the police union, which opposed the post creation? I mean, they're under enough pressures. We don't need another pressure from someone who thinks
Right.
they know what our job is. I think
Right.
that I'm not trying not to characterize it in being very simple. It's a little more complicated than
Right.
that. But are you looking more as the legal person, keeping the police honest if they aren't, which I'm assuming they are,
Right.
just keeping and advising them as to maintaining the legal standards?
Right. I think that that probably does drive a lot of the review that our office does. Most policing obviously is based in the law, and so it has to have a clear connection to what the law requires. I don't give a second opinion or a legal
Right,
opinion.
or a second guess everything.
Because this is also information that everybody, a lay person, should have or be able to tell too. So I mean, there is, people should be able to know, well, what are my rights on a traffic stop? How far can the officer go? Because officers typically are not lawyers, although some are too. But so you don't have to have that level of expertise. However, obviously it helps because you are talking about a lot of legalities, and I think it also helps to try to bring some clarity to some of these issues that I think people think are complicated because they're legal issues.
And one issue might be the issue that you brought up about searching
Right,
vehicles.
right.
And the fact the police union paper, The Shield, had an editorial this week about a directive given by Don Kerry, kind of based in some of the concerns you had.
Right.
And kind of explain that, because this whole issue of when you search and whatever, the new recommendation from the chief, or the order, or whatever called, directive,
Right.
is that you need to get permission,
Right.
written permission from them to do searches. And so my automatic thing was, well, what if they're in danger?
Right.
And the editorial in the Police Shield said, but it's dangerous.
Right.
But you explained to me there are different legal standards.
Right.
And certainly safety is always the concern, and should be for
And
all.
as the facts change, then the authority of the officer changes. In order to do a consent search, consent implies you have to have permission. And so the only difference is whether it was verbal or written. The law only requires a verbal, but a lot of departments are going to written permission, for a lot of reasons.
Just to cover their
Yes, well, and
themselves.
it's convincing if you have, it's much more convincing if you have a person who's actually written a consent form.
And then the only issue is whether it's coerced or something.
Right.
But generally that's accepted in a court.
Right, and so, but if there were a danger where an officer felt that there was, the person was armed and dangerous, there's no requirement to get consent to do a pat-down search. So as the facts change, then also the level of authority changes. That is not impacted by whether or not you have a written versus a verbal consent form.
Do you think the police union's concern is a red herring, or do you think it just deserves more discussion and maybe clarification?
Probably more discussion and clarification, which is actually going on right now. The chief assembled a group of, some people from the law department, some officers, which I think is a really good idea, so that they can hash out those issues and make sure they have a policy that's going to be comport with the law, but also satisfy all those concerns.
Well, certainly that officer's and that sergeant's editorial that says, my advice is simply don't comply, at least woke people up.
Right, and that kind of caused a separate issue, but...
Right, that's a whole other possible
Right.
disciplinary issue. But what have you learned in 2 years? Because there are so few auditors, and as you mentioned, they all have different jurisdictions, powers, and whatever, that surprised you. And what did you learn or come to find was as you expected?
They're almost the same answer, to tell you the truth.
I can understand that.
I think that, we live in a complicated society, and a lot of it is driven by these legal rules. And I think that people, both the citizens as well as officers, have a real interest and thirst for trying to know more about that. And it's always concerned me as a lawyer that people know what they're, what's lawful, and be able to inform themselves and to make sure that they have good access to that information.
And not only know what their rights are and the limits of police, but know what is appropriate for them.
Exactly. What if I take this next step? Is this going to cause me to end up in handcuffs or end up? And you should absolutely know that there should be some expectation. And I think it's one of the greatest purposes our office can serve is to dispense with information that's going to give both police officers that clarity as well as the public that clarity, and hopefully create that expectation so people know how to interact with the police and citizens.
Right. I should mention that we're not talking about millions of complaints.
No.
In the last quarter, it was 38 initiated investigations,
right.
Something right around there.
Right.
So.
Right. I think the year before we started, the annual number was about 30, and in these 7 quarters, we're at about 25 to 30 completed. Those are investigations, and then the contacts average around 160 per quarter.
Do you feel that people are more? The process is making people are taking advantage of the process more.
I think it's more
just
available.
Kind of this,
right.
Knowing there's more involved and more people watching.
Right. There was an increase, but there wasn't a huge. It wasn't a wild spike. And so, yes, I think people do call more because they actually have a place where they can get some information.
It's you and this fine young woman that works in an administrative position with you. Do you need more help?
We'd love more help. Actually, we do have somebody who's doing some research for us. We've gotten some funding, and that's been a tremendous help, too.
Well, good luck to you.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope the communication stays fairly good between the police and fire departments and you. It seems to be working out.
It has. I think it's been very positive.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Tristan Bond, she is the Omaha Public Safety Auditor. You can catch any of our past shows or this show as soon as they get it on the computer at unotv.unomaha.edu. Thanks, Tristan.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us this week on Consider This.